Good evening. My name is Nicole Imgrund, and I'm the owner and director of Rivers Edge Counseling Center. Welcome to our Memory, Attention, and Executive Functioning Strategies webinar. Here at Rivers Edge, we have a series of Wellness Matters talks that are part of our commitment to community service and mental health education in St. Albert. We have a couple of talks every month, and if you go to the events page of our website, you can see what talks we have coming up. We've now added also webinars to our series of talks, and this is one of them. And I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Rhonda Wizniak, who is part of our team here at Rivers Edge. She is our psychological testing and assessment specialist. Rhonda is a registered psychologist who began her career as a teacher. She worked in a variety of educational settings, from early childhood, junior high school, students with special needs, and university students. After receiving doctoral and master's degrees in educational psychology, Rhonda has spent the last 10 years in school settings to provide assessment and consultation services. Rhonda enjoys working with individuals with diverse learning and behavioral needs. Rhonda provides assessments for us here at Rivers Edge, including cognitive, academic, adaptive, emotional, and behavioral assessments. Rhonda believes that the assessment process can provide important information for individuals and families to understand their own strengths and weaknesses, as well as provide recommendations to increase success in different environments. Very happy to have you here tonight, Rhonda, for this talk. And we're going to share a screen with you so you can show your presentation. We'll begin.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with my presentation here. Executive function is really the overall umbrella that all of those functions fall underneath. So I have included a few handouts, and they are included on our page, my Rivers Edge counseling page. But in terms of the presentation, I'm just going to go through this, and if there's anything that you would like to have shared and read about a little bit more, then you can let us know through the question and answer. Basically, what executive functions are the airport controllers of our brain. They are making sure we pay attention to the things that are most important to the setting that we're in, and also disregarding things that may not be as important. So these include things like intentional control, inhibiting your response in certain situations, your memory, and your flexibility, but also more complex things such as reasoning, problem solving, and planning. So this is just the way that we control our behavior and how we monitor our own behavior. And this is important if we're trying to attain any kinds of goals. And they gradually develop and change across the lifespan, and they can be improved over time. And also, similarly, these cognitive processes can be adversely affected in a variety of events, which can affect an individual. So the important thing to understand about executive functions is that they are things that can be developed, and they do develop over the lifespan. They're not things that we expect preschoolers to do very well, because it takes some time to develop it. But there's always ways to improve it, although it's not as easy, and it doesn't take kind of a one-time strategy. It has to be something that's more ongoing. And in terms of things that can be adversely affected in regards to executive functions, and that can be a number of things. It could be a high level of stress in your home. It could be something neurological, or a brain injury, or a trauma of some type. All of those things can affect your ability to do executive functioning really well. So some of the things that we talk about in regards to executive function, and this slide comes from Russell Barkley, and Russell Barkley has been known to be an expert in ADHD. He's written many books on the topic, and so just to let you know that this slide comes from some of his work. But the things that are important in terms of executive functioning is our ability to inhibit our behavior or stop our behavior in a setting that is not appropriate. Our ability to visualize, and in regards to visualization, the concept of time, Russell Barkley talks about a lot, about how students with ADHD have a really difficult time understanding time and how long a period of time is. And so we're often recommending give students lots of warning, use visual timers, because our inherent sense of time can be impaired. So they could be working on something for a really long time and not notice it, or also work on it for a very short time and see it as a very arduous or difficult task. The ability to talk to yourself, to guide yourself, to ask questions and give yourself instructions. We are always talking to ourselves in our mind, and good learners do that, and they understand the benefits that talking to yourself provides. And other students just need to be taught that that's an important process to go through. Our ability to emotionally regulate, so to inhibit strong emotion in a setting that it's not appropriate, to moderate our emotions, and also to problem solve. So that means manipulating images, reasoning, using novel information to solve a problem. So this is a picture of our brain, and the frontal lobe, I'm not sure if you can see me doing this, the frontal lobe right here, that is where most of our executive functioning skills are housed. If you notice the brain, the most primitive or parts of the brain that we all come with, the brain develops sort of from the center out. And so when we look at the frontal lobe, it can be the last to develop, but it also can be really susceptible to things like concussions and brain injuries because of where it's placed right there. And the brainstem in the center are things that are more like emotions, strong emotions, fight or flight, things related to our basic functioning like eating and looking after our basic needs. So when, if you've heard people talk about fight or flight, when you are in an incredibly stressful situation, some of these functions shut down to spend more time worrying about getting yourself out of there or reacting in a way that keeps your body safe, because our brains and bodies will always resort to that. It's not a time that you can be necessarily a very complex problem solver, but you'll usually take the easiest way to safety. When we look at executive functioning, and this is my role is in assessment, and I often see this overlap, is that students with ADHD, diagnosed ADHD, and students with diagnosed learning disabilities often have, I'm not sure that this is a good representation of what I'm trying to say, but executive functioning skills and deficits almost always come hand in hand. So if you aren't very good at paying attention, that is a reflection of executive functioning. And students with learning disabilities, as a part of the diagnostic criteria, there has to be an impact in things like organization or ability to organize and manipulate sounds or information. And so executive functioning skills are inherent in both of these diagnoses. So if you are diagnosed with one or the other, for sure executive functioning is impacted, and perhaps that was where the issue was to begin with. It's hard to kind of put which came first, but they are often overlapped. So what does this look like in the students and adolescents that we see? So in regards to attention, difficulty paying attention to things that are not interesting to them specifically. They're easily distracted, often paying attention to people, things, and noise that are not central to the task at hand. And Russell Barkley describes this as there's no filter. So when you're in a classroom, the students outside walking in the hallway, the gym class that's outside the window, the student across the classroom that's tapping their pencil, all of those things students are equally paying attention to, and not understanding or not being able to focus their attention on the teacher and block out some of those other things. So sometimes it's not that students aren't paying attention, it's that to anything, it's that they're paying attention to everything, and they're not able to prioritize what is most important in terms of the setting that they're in at that time. And then when they drift, they don't know how to re-alert themselves. All people drift, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the attention cycle, but all people drift, and it's just about how you learn the skills to re-alert yourself. When I am talking to students, I always will ask them if there's a question about attentional challenges, is when you stop paying attention, do you notice, or is it always the teacher that tells you? We want students to notice when they're not paying attention too, and then they can refocus themselves. Memory overload, they can't always hold directions in their head, and they may be told several times what to do. And salient details are clouded by unimportant details. So what that means is when a student reads a story or is presented with a large project, they'll become very focused on one or two little pieces and don't really see the big picture. That is really not those little pieces. This is when sometimes executive functioning challenges aren't really seen until students get older, because memory can make up for it in the early years, and then eventually when topics become more complex, that your memory can't account for those challenges. And then approach to tasks. So they're not able to consider the details and the big picture at the same time. They have trouble knowing where to start. They have difficulty completing all aspects, may do some parts and leave others, and have trouble planning out a task, aren't sure how long a task will take. So you often hear students, and I'm not saying many students have a similar issue where they'll leave things to the last minute and they have to do it all at one time. But this is more of an overwhelming every single time. They have trouble planning it out. They'll spend an exorbitant amount of time at the beginning piece and then not understand that the end piece is the most important. So they often need a lot of help planning things out in order to be successful. And flexibility, so being able to stick with a plan even when it's clear the plan isn't working. So they'll keep doing the same things over and over when it doesn't appear to be working to them, have trouble adjusting to change, and may appear very rigid and inflexible. They can hold on really strongly to rules because it's comforting. It doesn't make things so ambiguous, and can have difficulty revising or making their decisions. Impulsivity, the other ones tend to be more impact a student in the classroom and at school or doing tasks at home. Impulsivity is the one that will get them in trouble. So often acting without thinking, and it can have impact socially because they will sometimes do things without thinking of the consequences and have a hard time getting their way out of binds because the approach wasn't well planned. But just keep in mind that children and adolescents can engage in behaviors that appear to be willful defiance, but they're actually trying to overcome a skill deficit. So this is when a student doesn't know how to approach a task or doesn't know how to stop themselves from doing something that may impact someone else. So often our first response can be to punish students or children, and sometimes it's just really important to think about, is there a skill deficit that they have, and how can we teach them how to do that? And the thing is that these skills are not things that are taught in 1 or 2 lessons. It means something that's overall happening every day and over many different days, over many different years, and for students to really get the hang of how to do that well if it doesn't come to them inherently. And so it involves teaching children how to think and not just what to think. So it's just important to keep in mind that when we ask children to do tasks for which they do not have the skill sets, it's likely that the defensive brain will become activated. And so those are some of the more primitive parts of our brain, and these moments are when we'll see meltdowns, anxiety, agitation, anger, or fear. Anxiety also is often described for students with executive functioning challenges because they become very nervous or worried because they don't know how to approach a task. So they're kind of in this constant state of confusion, which can, of course, become anxiety provoking. And so it's important to keep in mind that when you see a meltdown, it may be because the child doesn't know what to do or how to do it, and not necessarily because they want to be difficult, or they could just be overwhelmed at that time. And at these times, it's always important to try to help them find their calm so that the thinker can come online. When you are in a state of meltdown, anxiety, anger, or fear, your frontal lobe is not working at all. And so we can't problem solve, and these are times where we say things to students like, or children, I always say students, sorry, you can use the word child, adolescent interchangeably, use your words. These are the times that using their words will be the most difficult for them. So it's time to just like bring things back to breathing and calm. And then when we get to a place, then you can find a happier way to problem solve. The point is to try to teach the skills proactively, because in those periods of high anxiety or anger, it will be very difficult. This professor, Dr. Lynn Kenny, and she does some presentations. She was in Edmonton last year. She does a lot of work on executive functioning for young children. I would recommend following her on Facebook or on Twitter because she posts a lot of very interesting articles that apply to what we're talking about today. One of the handouts is actually one of her handouts that I was sharing.
Actually, if you don't mind me interjecting about my handouts, I didn't mention at the beginning, but if you go to the website, the team page, and then to Rhonda's page, at the end of her bio, you'll see both of the handouts that she has and that she'll be referring to today, and they'll stay available to you after the webinar.
So first things first, as always are most important, we cannot address executive functioning skills if some other parts are not in line. So most importantly, sleep, nutrition, that children are physically active every day, and that they are emotionally healthy. And when all those things are in place, I can't even start to think about or talk about executive functioning until those things are in place. So in terms of how do we teach executive functioning skills, and they are certainly things that can be taught. The challenging part is that you have to make a commitment over a long period of time and to integrate these things as much as possible into your day-to-day life. So that means providing opportunities to make predictions. So in terms of make predictions is, what do you think would happen if? And sometimes students can be very aware that you're talking about something that they do. So I'll use things like TV shows or something that I see somewhere else where I will pause it and then have that chance to make predictions of what was going to happen. Using books that have a subject or topic that relates to making predictions can be good. Solving a variety of different types of problems and in different types of ways. So in this case, you're really looking at what a child does well. So if they're really good at building or approaching a task like that, bring them back to that when they're having a trouble solving a problem that's different. So when you're building one of your Lego things, what do you do first? You make a plan. And so then when we're reading this book together, maybe we should make a plan of what we might look for in terms of words, most important words, and then go back to that. Pursuing inquiries, so asking questions and trying to solve problems. Analyzing what information you need to complete a task, and considering how to acquire any skills or knowledge that a child needs to reach the goal. So if a child is to be successful and what is the issue, then what's the plan to get there? And this is the most important parts in terms of parents, is model, model, model. And that means modeling how you prioritize tasks at home. We start doing a lot of things inherently, and children don't see that we actually use these skills all the time because we don't model them. So every time at the beginning of the week, and sometimes we have to be very obvious about it because we have trouble with this. So at the beginning of the week, how are we going to prioritize which is most important to get done, what would be good to get done, and if we get to it, that's fine. So being able to have your children see you doing those kinds of things is really important. Setting goals for yourself and setting goals for the family and monitoring your progress towards those goals. How you transfer learning to different situations. And the only way that children know that you're doing that is by talking it through. Metacognition, that's about thinking about how you're thinking. And so going through how you problem solve about something that is difficult for you, and then how you manage emotions. I would be very obvious about explaining to children how you manage your emotions on times of frustration. I don't use the word anger very often because to me it feels like something that's a little out of our control, and we want children to see that our emotions are in our control. So I usually use frustration because frustration is wanting something to happen that's not happening. And we experience those moments every single day, and we have to model out loud how we're dealing with it, and also to talk about times that we don't manage it well. So there is a handout on the website, and I don't have one to kind of show you up here, but I would recommend minimizing this if you can and looking through the handout. The handout is about teaching children how to plan, and it is also written by Dr. Lynn Kenny, and I would recommend that you read through that. And it talks about how every day we help students plan, how we help them prioritize, how maybe at the beginning of the night before we plan out what we're going to wear, especially if mornings are very challenging, that we plan what needs to go in their backpack. And for students or children that have executive functioning challenges, using checklists, using visuals are incredibly important for them because it's going to teach them a skill that they will need lifelong. So some people, I'm not one of them, can just have an idea in their head all the time about what's happening during the week, and they can move through it a bit on the seat of their pants. Other people need to say, okay, on Monday we have to do this. These are the things we need in your bag. Wednesday, library day. The library books have to be. So I would use big calendars. I would put visuals, and I would start out by modeling to everyone in your house how you use that. After a month or so of you modeling that, then the prompt is for the child to do it. So you want to say, look at the calendar and see what we'll need for tomorrow, and then have them do that and getting in the habit of it. And it takes, they say 21 days to reach a habit. And sometimes we're really good at this at the beginning. So we'll have a checklist at the door that the child can't come out of the room until they have the certain number of things. They check it off. And we hope that that becomes a habit after a period of time. And sometimes, and with all children and all adolescents and all adults, we regress. So then we start having difficulties with it again. And that's just a sign that we need more structure to learn those skills and be more obvious about it. So there are some suggestions in that handout. Also comes from Lynn Kenny about ways to assist with executive functioning, and I would recommend having a read through that. The one thing that is important for children and adolescents to understand is to understand our attention cycle And all people go through this attention cycle. So that means we select something that we're paying attention to, we attend to it, we sustain it for a little while, and then we drift away. So we have all sat in meetings, we have all sat in, hopefully not right now, but it may be starting to happen at 30 minutes in, you start to drift away, and then our goal is to re-alert, reselect, and alert again to the stimulus. And we recommend, your brain might need a little bit of a break. Maybe you get up and have a sip of water, you start walking around, you move around a bit, that's okay. We want to encourage students to understand how they know they're not paying attention, give themselves a little break, and then how you re-alert to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. It is adaptive and it is evolutionary that we all go through this. It's just about, the point is not that we're going to lose attention, it's that we're able to re-alert back to what we're supposed to be paying attention to. Keeping in mind, when the language, for example, in a classroom, if a student is having a hard time understanding the language that is being used, that will create more difficulty paying attention. So then we look at how we're able to simplify the language that's being used. If I was sitting in a university physics class right now, it wouldn't take very long until I would start drifting away, and it would be hard for me to re-alert because I don't understand the language that's being used. So that's one of the important reasons that one thing that it's important for students to do at home is to learn the vocabulary that they're learning at school. So that means if they're learning a certain content area, that we are really clear on what the vocabulary is they want to learn, and then we talk about it at home by using things that you know your child knows about, or by looking it up on the internet, and not learning it in a really structured way, but more just about, remember that time when we were camping and we saw, trying to find an example, but we saw the frost on the leaves, and when they're talking about the water cycle, like that's an example. And so just bring it back to things that you know that your child is familiar with. A teacher would have no idea about the background experiences, and especially children that are highly verbal, that can be really good for them in terms of learning by associating with things that you know and that they know about. And also things that are emotionally relevant to them. When we talked about our brains are more likely to remember things that have emotion related to them or people that are really important to them. So we can teach adolescents about the attention cycle and children. And then this is just an example of a dialogue. So sometimes parents don't know what to say. So this is an example. This is a teacher and a student, but it could be anyone. So when the teacher says, you know how you told me it was hard to pay attention in math today, and the student says it was so hard, I just started thinking about skateboarding. And the teacher said, that makes sense. Your brain switches to a more comfortable topic when it becomes stressed. So this is what I mean by teaching children about how to think rather than what to think. And the student said, I didn't know I was stressed. That makes sense. Drifting is a way for your brain to take a break, and it's part of the attention cycle. And then they often use the words cognitive detectives. We're just learning about your brain and your attention has many parts. Once you know more about them, we can shift in between. So a student doesn't learn this in 1 or 2 lessons. It comes by a daily dialogue about what they're experiencing and expressing it. So some attention strategies, consider using a timer. I would recommend a visual timer. If you have iPads, you can download visual timer apps so that a student or a child has a better sense of time. Helping a child decide what to do in what order. It will set a child up for failure who has executive functioning challenges to give them a big project without starting with where to start. And you are going to guide that as the adult for a while, and then we give a little bit of a piece to the children as they become ready. So then we have a conversation, where do you think you would start? Once they've had a lot of practice with it, they'll become better at that. One of the ways we can fail children is by knowing they have difficulty with it and keep doing it for them. And then in junior high, that becomes a real challenge. So we need to make sure we're trying to build independence all the time, staying in close proximity to an adult, developing a verbal or visual cueing system. If a student doesn't recognize, or a child doesn't recognize that they're drifting, that we can show them by a verbal or visual sign. It could be a tap on the desk, it could be a touch on the shoulder, it could be any kind of sign. Encouraging attention to detail, giving second chances, having breaks, and reinforcing children when they use positive strategies to maintain attention and impulsivity. It is actually almost impossible for a child to pay attention to nothing or to be impulsive every single minute of the day, understanding that children make positive choices much more than they make negative choices, so that we recognize that and we talk about it. So I would say, oh, I noticed today you were able to work on that math set for longer than you usually do. What do you think was about that helped you do that? And so that's helping the child think about their own thinking instead of just telling them what to do. So working memory. Memory is one. Working memory is almost always impacted if you have ADHD or you have executive functioning challenges. We can't open a child's brain and fix their memory, but we can help them practice memory strategies. And in terms of, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but as children get older, technology devices are our best working memory strategy. But one thing can be to help work on visualization skills, so being able to visualize words and numbers, having your child teach you how to do something or teach a younger child in your house, suggesting games that involve memory. Initially, children that are not good with memory will avoid those kinds of games. However, they'll almost always do something and it involves a trusted adult that was going to support them while playing it. Playing cards, encouraging active reading. So active reading means asking questions and engaging in text. So that can mean, and if these are your own books at home, I would recommend encouraging them to underline words, write a question mark in the margins, so that you're actively engaging in it. And sometimes it can be reading the same book as your child is reading and asking them questions. And what do you think is going to happen next? And don't you think it was interesting when? And that can be a really important piece of being able to see that reading is actually not a passive process, and that the only way that we comprehend, and using things like, what did that make you think of? Do you remember when we did something similar? Chunking information into smaller pieces. I remember when I was going to university, and I started university with one of my good friends, and she was in science, and I had to take one science class, and I took botany with her just because I could have a friend in my class, which was, the basis of many decisions I made. But she would try, and she had a really good memory. She was very smart. She got through school easily using her memory. But when you had to remember textbooks and textbooks worth of plants, she just couldn't do it because she was trying to remember them all individually and not how they're connected. So you don't actually remember everything individually, and our brains actually can't. We have to put things in file folders that are connected. And students with working memory challenges don't do that inherently. And so we have to help teach them how to do that. And textbooks often are set up in a way that things that are similar are linked together. And I would recommend having students use one sheet of paper and to put everything that is most important in that chapter on this piece of paper using a web or something visual, and to see how they're connected rather than trying to remember it all individually. And if you understand the connections, then it can help you with problem solving instead of just being able to answer rote questions. So the ways that we how memory is improved is by being able to see patterns, and students that are very good visual learners, they understand patterns, but it's just how do you use that to work for you. So patterns can be really good in terms of math. If you never understand that math is actually one big pattern and I can figure out something I didn't know just because I know there's a pattern to it, or that words, many words in the English language have patterns, to see those things, you can make connections rather than learning every single word individually. We can learn them as a group. Associating images or topics to things that we know about or know a lot about. Images, so we connect things through images or by categories or telling a story. So I would often, when I was trying to remember something for school, I would tell a story or write a sentence that I would remember. I would use the letters in that sentence to remind myself, and we do that, like we use bed mass and other, but we want to encourage students to do a similar kind of thing if they're having trouble remembering something. So there is another handout. The second handout is from the Can Learn Society, which is in Calgary, and that is an association for students with learning disabilities, and they put out a handout about working memory, and it is much more geared to adolescents. So the first handout that I provided to you is more designed for younger, early or middle childhood times, and the second one is more about working memory. And it's important that adolescents read those things and they understand that, and it's not, it's just the way our brain is, and to appreciate diversity, but also to understand that we can use strategies to improve our memory and improve our performance in school. One of the areas that students with executive functioning challenges, attention, and memory are organization, will trip them up. And so when they're already dealing with something around attention or impulsivity, and then the organization comes on top of that, it just creates a lot of stress and anxiety because they constantly feel like they don't have the things that they need. It's frustrating to parents, it's frustrating to students. And so teaching organizational skills from a really young age is really important. So developing routines around organization. Some people are naturally organized. I appreciate those people. They do not live in my house. So the important thing for me is that every week I need to spend time organizing our house, organizing things that we need, and I have to be really obvious about it because it doesn't come naturally for me. So if it does come naturally for you and not for your child, you have to break it down and explain it and show why you do it, and things that come naturally to you, you might really need to describe. Using a daily agenda and schedule that a student has all the time. When you don't know what's happening in a day, that becomes really stressful. And so that's important that your child knows if they have something different that's happening that day, that they're prepared for that. And I always encourage teachers to have a visual schedule so all the students know what's happening in a day, and many students won't ever need to use that, but others that do, it will be really important. Checklists that are in view at all times, graphic organizers, exemplars, outlines. So exemplars is an example of what it should look like. So if it's something like cleaning your room and they're continually leaving out one part, or what should your bag look like, I would do it exactly how you think it should be done. You take a picture of it and you use it as a cue on their wall. So then you say, when you come back, instead of saying, what, this isn't a clean room, you still have socks all over the floor and you still have this, I give them the picture and say, does it look like this picture? Because this is what I want it to look like. And then you encourage them to notice the things that may not be the same, and then you come back and review it. The same goes for their bag, the same goes for an assignment. So whenever possible, to be asking teachers for an exemplar or what it should look like at the end, or an example of one from last year, because when students have a hard time planning, they don't know what the end looks like. So it never feels like they're ever going to get there. Breaking down assignments, setting goals, and ensuring checkpoints. You're going to do that with kids early on, and hopefully that they will take on some of that. Creating a home for school items at home and help children return items to their home at the end of each day. So sometimes with students, I will put a mat in the bottom of their desk, and I will put a square for where their book is supposed to go, and a rectangle for where their pencil is supposed to go, and almost set out a map. And using a whiteboard, as children get older, I would have a whiteboard at the back door and write a note saying, are you sure you have this? Make sure you have that. And also helping them problem solve if they forget. And helping them problem solve is not always having a parent run it to them, but to be able to figure out how, it's not an opportunity for punishment, but it is an opportunity for learning and how to, it doesn't help children or adolescents if we do it for them, because eventually they will have to do it on their own. So processing speed is another part of executive functioning. This is something that is tested on cognitive assessments, and it can be extremely frustrating when a child's processing speed is slower than their problem solving. So even though orally you can ask them questions and they can explain things at a very high level, but actually putting it down onto paper can result in anxiety. It kind of always feels like they're a step behind. So some strategies can be building in extra time, teaching self-advocacy. So this is really important. The things, we are never going to increase a student's processing speed dramatically, but we have to teach them strategies on how to use their other strengths to work for them. But if a student does not come out of grade 6 being able to say, I sometimes need more time, can I take this home and finish it? And if your child is taking an extraordinary amount of time to finish that, that's something you want to talk to teachers about, because if you have a slow processing speed, for the most part, quality is more important than quantity. Writing down or emailing questions to the teacher if they have trouble thinking on the spot. Writing down simple instructions so they can refer back to them. If a child at home has to do 1 or 2 or 3 things, write it down for them. Don't remind them, refer them back to the checklist. And then I spoke about focusing on quality over quantity. The other important part, and these ones can be more obvious because it involves usually a behavioral or emotional meltdown, is about self-regulation. So recognizing escalation, asking for help, and stopping it. So the same thing with attention. We all feel overwhelmed, we feel stressed. It's about how to recognize that it's happening and using a strategy to calm yourself down. Using breathing or music or motor movement, and sometimes energy release skills like jump ropes, jumping jacks, trampolines. More and more, you would be surprised now how many schools have exercise bikes in the classrooms for this purpose. There's come more of a movement towards using appropriate movement to initiate calm. And if your child or someone else is having a meltdown, that one of the most important pieces of advice I had as a psychologist when dealing with really challenging situations is a colleague told me, never underestimate the power of a calm presence. And so sometimes it can't be you in that moment, and then it's important to remove yourself if everyone is safe. But whenever a child is escalating, the more you can model what it's like to be calm, to be reassuring, and that's what we call co-regulation. A child will generally come down to that calmer spot, but the more you escalate, the more likely it is that they're going to escalate. So more specifically for adolescents, planning, your frontal lobe is becoming more developed in adolescence. Surely we don't think it's fully developed until well into our 20s, but we still have higher expectations for them in terms of focusing on planning, monitoring themselves, encouraging self-talk that focuses on growth, understanding the motivation of others and the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, reflection, and then using technology to increase organization and planning. And now we have so many tools that we did not have in our hands even not that long ago. And so our goal is that students access and use tools that are available to them. And that's an important piece of being a self-advocate. If your child has a real difficulty with reading and writing and getting ideas down onto paper, we don't want to eliminate reading and writing, but we do want to have some supports. I would recommend students have Chromebooks, and Read and Write for Google is one option that is a good technology support. You can use the tools in that application to, for example, when I saw a child who had said that they couldn't, I asked them, what do you think about writing? And she said, I get really excited about all my ideas, but when I try to write them down, I can't spell any of them, and so then I get really discouraged. If we want children to be readers and writers, we need them to read and write. And so Google, Read and Write for Google, at least when I showed her about how to use a laptop and to talk into it, and it wrote all of her ideas. And for her to just see for the first time a full page of writing, even though it was a mishmash and going back to edit it, and that we can definitely do. But it was the first time that she could be excited about her ideas and actually have it come out in a way that was able to demonstrate things that she knows. iPhones and iPads can provide a number of supports, especially about planning, how to use task lists, how to set reminders on your phone. If you have if you constantly have to take medication at a certain time, you can set a reminder on your phone. And to actually see those things as tools, and many of our children understand some of those tools more than we have. A visual timer for sure I would have on an iPad, and I would use it. When you ask a child to read for 20 minutes, I would set the timer on the iPad so that they can see it, just because they have a hard time recognizing amount of time, and they can feel like it's forever. And then they get a sense of when you say, in 5 minutes we have to do this, in 2 minutes we have to do that. So parents can become very frustrated when they try to give those types of prompts, because a child actually does no idea what 5 minutes is. And so when you say 5 minutes and then they still get upset, it's because they didn't have a sense of that amount of time. And that we have students that are able to ask for what they need and to advocate for their own needs. So if there's one skill that you want to be able to teach your children, it's to be able to ask for what they need and be able to express that to teachers, employers, or anyone they're working with. What time is it? 7:49. Okay, so this is the period of time that we have for questions. So if Nicole has had any questions, and if you have any,
we don't have any questions by the participants yet. I'll just remind you again that there's a Q&A button at the bottom, and you're welcome to use it, and I'm keeping an eye on it here. I have a couple questions, Rhonda, while we give people a chance to maybe type some out. So one of them is just like a curiosity, and I know it's something like my friends and I who are moms wonder about a lot, which is the role of technology inattention and memory. It's just
Mhm.
such a big part of our kids' lives, so it way wasn't for us. I'm just wondering your opinion on that. Like, you've mentioned some ways that technology can be supportive. What's your sense of the way it can hinder some of these functionings for kids?
Well, the overuse of technology can definitely delay some of the development of some of those skills because um, it provides constant feedback. And if you have constant feedback from a person, you are much more likely to be engaged with them. So if I was sitting and all of the participants were here in a room and every 3 seconds I asked you a question or pointed on you or showed you something very novel, then you would be very likely to be able to pay attention the whole time. So it doesn't, the overuse of technology when we're younger, it doesn't help students or children to develop those parts of the brain in terms of periods of time where there isn't constant feedback, that there are times where you can be bored and lose focus, or that even social interaction skills, although social interaction is evolving with the use of technology, and it's important to be a part of the social community that you are aware and use those things. But if we don't use things that involve putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, hearing about someone's experience, seeing the nonverbal signals of someone else, you will constantly make social mistakes. So and this is, I think it's more harmful for children of those things that don't come naturally, because then they're counting on this constant feedback rather than having the chance to develop some of those skills. So I think, and then, but also keeping in mind, it's like there's always the other side to this. If children have or adolescents have real trouble with executive functioning, attention, and school is a real challenge for them, they also need the opportunity to take a break, and for whatever that looks like for them. So if it is technology, then I think there's just a time and a place for all of it, but just keeping in mind when a child gives constant feedback, then it just doesn't give them the opportunity to develop some of those things that we want them to develop, especially when they're younger.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that helps. I'm still not seeing other questions of anyone else, so I'll jump in with one more just to give people another couple minutes, maybe here. As I have 4 boys, and I think most of what you said at some point resonates with what I've seen in one of my kids. I'm just wondering, as parents, when we're thinking about our kids at home and school, like what would you recommend in terms of how we might start to think about testing or assessment for our kids? What would be, when we start to get to the point, I'm sure all of these things, like most any part of human psychology and behavior, is somewhere on the spectrum of normal, of course, but what are sort of cues that you might consider testing?
Sure. Well, one thing is, if you want, I'm talking about general strategies here, but if there is, you had a more specific concern, that would be difficult to answer unless I had done a full assessment. And so, for example, lots of people will ask about assessment for ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely do a behavior rating scale and look at the symptoms related to ADHD. But as I spoke about on the chart with the overlapping circles, there's usually some other part of cognition, like memory or speed, that is impacted if you have ADHD. So it's difficult to just look at symptoms without looking at the whole picture. So I always recommend to parents to look at both, because we want to make sure that if we're making a plan to improve some of those things, that we know it's not just attention, or that it could be memory, and how to help them. And also learning disabilities are often associated. So that's why I think it's important to have a full and comprehensive picture rather than looking at a small piece, especially in regards to ADHD. But everything that I talked about all children, all adolescents will show those challenges because it's part of development. So the key of when you might want to consider some more further of assessment is when it is impacting their ability to function at school or at home to a significant degree. So that's kind of always the line. So when you keep hearing about it from teachers, when they're having difficulties outside of school and they're having difficulties maybe making friends, or if you just want a better understanding about how your child understands and reasons with information, that would be maybe when a more specific and comprehensive assessment would be important. But for me, the most important part is impact on your functioning that is not in line with your same age peers. So the reason teachers, teachers can be a good source of information in that regard is they see 30 other children that are the same age every single day. And so they have a good measure of whether that's in line with the same age peer group or it's not. And so that they can be a good source of that information. Or if it's different than your other children in your home or cousins or family members, that's when you have become concerned. So that would be what I would recommend in terms of making that decision.
Good, thanks. And I see we have a couple of questions from participants too. So one is asking, how can we make a child understand when they need to do something and they don't have a choice?
How can we make them understand that?
Yeah.
Well, I don't.
All the parents are nodding.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, yes, as my own children, this does not always come inherently. I see this comes back to starting early on, or to starting about things that we do have choices about and things that we don't. So I would talk about that in my own life. There are things that I can choose to do and where I have lots of different choices, and times that I don't. And you don't want to have that discussion when you're in the heat of a battle about something that they don't have a choice about. It starts on times where it actually has nothing to do with what you're doing. So it would be a dinner table conversation, or it would be a discussion at the table where you said, oh, at work today, my supervisor told me I needed to do this, and I really would have rather been doing something else, but I knew that I had to follow through with what they asked about that. So to look at those kinds of teaching opportunities, and then I would even brainstorm with kids. What are the things that we have choices about? What are the things we don't have choices about? And then so you start to see some difficulty about something they don't have a choice about, to say, oh, was that on our list of things that we do have choice about, things that we don't? So it's just about trying to be as proactive as possible in things that you see are coming up as an issue. Of course, we can't, there are things that we can't force kids to do, but, and we always want to lean towards recognizing or rewarding them for doing the things that they are doing right, rather than punishing. But of course, that comes in at some points with losing privileges, and you have to figure out what a child's motivation is and then try to work around it, understanding that we're not bribing kids, we're doing things in their own best interest, and that's not a bribe.
Good, thanks. The next question is, how can you tell when it is stress-related or executive function?
Well, how can you tell? Well, if it was executive functioning, it's hard for me to say that just as a blanket statement, because it would have to be more, if you're having executive functioning, then it's kind of cyclical, right? So even if you don't have executive functioning challenges, if you are very stressed out, your executive functioning won't work well. And if you have executive functioning challenges And then you start to feel anxiety and stress about some of the things that you're experiencing because you're feeling nervous about it. So it's really hard to parcel out. If you have executive functioning challenges, it's the notion of stress is that stress kind of goes up and down. We can't be at a 10 for anxiety or a 10 for stress all the time. Eventually it has to come down. So stress sometimes can be more contextual or happen in a certain time, whereas executive functioning challenges you would see kind of all the time, even on times that are very unstressful. So that would kind of be one of the clues of whether it was one or not the other, because when you're on a family vacation and you say, oh, go get your coat, bring your shoes and grab your water bottle, and they come with one, it's not a stressful situation at all, but they come with one shoe and a banana, those are, you see it in more settings than just times where you're battling about schoolwork, but they're often related and can be related to each other.
Good. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. Let me just check one other place. Yep. I think that's it for now. Did you want to say something about resources, it looks like?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out some resources, and I probably should have put this up on the screen a little earlier so you had time to write them out. The Harvard Institute for the Developing Child, which is sort of the, I don't know what the right word, all of my references sort of sound.
While you're searching for that word, I'm just going to let people know our plan is to put the video of the webinar on Rhonda's page. So you'll have a chance if you miss all of that right now to get that later. Yeah.
So the Institute for the Developing Child is like the gold seal of developmental psychology, and they definitely put out resources that are related to development. And this is one, enhancing and practicing executive function skills with children from infancy to adolescence. And it gives some ideas about practicing early on. And not saying that if you didn't do this with your children early on, there's not a time to start, because executive functioning develops up until our 20s. There's always the opportunity to practice and develop it in the hopes that children and adolescents become more independent. So this is a good resource. Dr. Lynn Kenny and I had shared some of those. I would definitely follow her on Facebook because she posts a lot of very interesting articles. The Zones of Regulation is a book written by an occupational therapist whose child has a number of challenges with emotional regulation that came from a medical incident, but this can be really accessible, and it provides a lot of visuals. So if this was a challenge for your own children, I would recommend it in that you could print out the visuals and put them around your house. So they talk about your emotions being in a red, blue, green, or yellow zone. And so I would use words like, when you're not putting your shoes on, it puts me in the yellow zone because I'm getting really frustrated. And it can give you some language that, is easy for parents and children to understand. And it provides a lot of visuals, which we talked about in terms of checklist visuals that you can put in their room and all over your house if you need to.
It's a great resource. I was going to just also add that I think it's used really widely in the schools. I know.
Yeah, it is.
At some point, out of frustration, I printed it all off for my own family, and the kids already knew all about it. So
yeah, it is something. And that with things like this, it's really good if your school is using something that you use something similar, because we often use zones, but some people use red, yellow, green, and others use blue. So it can get confusing. So if your school is using something, or that you ask them for a suggestion, a lot of them use this one, but some of them, the colors or the descriptors are a bit different. If a child already has difficulty with that, changing up the language doesn't help. So you can get that from the library. This understood.org is a reference from information was particularly related to learning disabilities. And Alberta Family Wellness, they published they have a website, and they call it What We Know Air Traffic Control. And it's about executive functioning as well, and about our development of it and how trauma can impact it, and some strategies. I was thinking about the use of a visual, and I have many psychologist friends with young children, and her daughter kept forgetting things that she needed at school. It was just driving her crazy because they'd have arguments. And so then I said, well, what would we recommend someone else do? And she's like, I don't know, make a visual. And so then I said, well, let's make a visual. So we used pictures, we cut it out, we laminated it, and we put it on her zipper on her backpack. And so it was the 4 things she needed to bring home: her library book, her agenda, her shoes. And then all of a sudden she starts bringing home those 4 things. And so just sometimes really small things. And then, you know, I would remove it and see if she could remember it for a week, and then re-put it back on, and you know, going from there. So just keeping in mind that some small strategies can help. And these are really good resources in terms of overall development of executive functioning.
Good. Is that the end of your presentation then?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Rhonda. I already feel all the time really lucky to have you part of our team, and especially when I see just the knowledge that you bring. I also know, and I'll just mention, that you're really generous with your time and helpful to parents who are considering doing some testing or assessment in this area, because it can be hard to know exactly what kind of, if testing is, you know, would be helpful, and what kind of testing. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of the participants who joined us this evening. Please go to our website when you have time, to the events page, and just see what our upcoming talks are. We're offering even more this year than ever, 2 and 3 a month live talks. You can come in, and then we'll feed you treats and coffee and tea too. But also, if you're interested in joining us from the comfort of your own home, we have a number of these lined up this year as well. So please feel free to join us anytime. If you'd like to revisit today's webinar or share it with other people, keep your eye out in the next week or so. We'll make sure that we have it on Rhonda's page, her bio page on our website as well. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll say goodbye.